Okay, today we're going to talk about financial statement or financial condition analysis. This is always one of my favorite topics because I would say 95% of what we're going to talk about today you will see in the real world. It's probably the most practical chapter in the textbook. There's one exception, I suppose, and that might be EVA, economic value added methods. You don't see that used a lot, but I will talk about it briefly because it's interesting to talk about how each part of that formula is affected and what managers can actually do to affect financial ratios. So what we're going to talk about now is really trying to get a handle on the overall health of an organization. And I know some of this will be review from 740, but I think we're going to probably dive in a little bit deeper. So the financial condition, what is basically asking the question is, does this organization have the financial capacity to fulfill its mission? And whether, and the for-profit sector it might be, does it have the financial capacity to reward shareholders? But essentially what we're trying to do is find the strengths and weaknesses of an organization, the financial strengths, the financial weaknesses of an organization. And we're going to do that by several techniques. The first is to look at the financial statements and get some ratio analyses from the financial statements. Operating indicators are basically statistics or other kinds of non-monetary, typically non-monetary, but sometimes monetary indicators as well. And then EVA, which we're going to pass over quite quickly. And so the first place to start with financial statement analysis is financial statements. The income statement you are all familiar with, and again, I'm not going to go through all those things, but I will point out the 8572 at the bottom, the net income of 8572. And then the balance sheet, which again I'm sure you're all familiar with in terms of the basic components of it. And then this is the liabilities and equity side. If this was the asset side, here's the liabilities and equity side. So the first set of financial statements, in addition to the income statement and the balance sheet, what you often see as well is the statement of cash flows. And a lot of people feel that this is an underutilized statement because it gives you a lot of information about what's actually happening in the organization from the constructed from the balance sheet and the income statement. So you can see the change in net assets there in the net income, the 8572, that is the number I just pointed out to you a minute ago. That's the net income for this hospital during the year. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at all the different cash flows that happened from operating activities, from the provision of patient care. And the first is depreciation, where we add back in 4130. Why do we do that? Why do we make it a positive number?
It's a non-cash expense.
It's a non-cash expense. So we got paid from the payers, our insurers, Medicare and Medicaid. Part of the payment we get is for depreciation of the building and equipment, but it is a non-cash expense. So that amount went up by $4.1 million. Increase in accounts receivable. That's a negative $1.1 million. Why is that negative? Right, because you have provided the service, there's been a cash outflow, but you have not yet been paid. So an increase in accounts receivable draws down your cash. Increase in inventories, same thing. You've increased, you use part of your wealth to buy additional inventory, your cash has gone down. A decrease in accounts payable. Why is that negative? Right, you owed people money, and therefore you wrote some checks to pay off those accounts payable, so again your cash level goes down. And finally, increase in accrued expenses. Essentially that is money that organizations put aside for taxes or for contingent liabilities or lawsuits that might be settled and so on. And essentially that's the same thing. You could also add that into net income. They're basically using part of their net income and putting it aside in a separate pot of money. Investment in plant and equipment, negative $4.3 million. What's happening there? Yeah, they've used $4.3 million of their cash to either renovate part of a building or buy some new equipment or whatever. But their cash has been drawn down by the fact that they invested in plant and equipment. Then there's cash flow from financing activities. So investment in short-term securities, negative $2 million. What does that mean? Why is it a negative? Well, what do you do when you invest in a short-term security? What do you do personally? You write someone a check. You write your broker or mutual fund or whatever, and you draw down your cash and you park it over here. So that is a decrease in your cash because you've parked some of it in short-term securities. Repayment of long-term debt. You've drawn your cash down by repaying your long-term debt to the tune of $2.2 million. Repayment of notes payable, the same thing, and same thing for the capital lease. The change in the current portion of the long-term debt is positive 150. Essentially what that probably means is that the current portion of the long-term debt last year was $150,000 greater than it is this year. So you have an extra $150,000 this year compared to last year because the portion is less. Overall, when you add up all those different things, what do you find?
Less cash this year than we did last year.
Yeah, they've used up. Last year they had $5 million. This year they've got $4.3 million. So they've used $800,000 for a variety of investment and financing and operating activities. So there's a lot of information on the statement of cash flows. The summary is that there's $11 million came in net cash flow, 4.3 of it went out the door and for fixed assets, 5.6 million in debt, marketable securities. When all that is added up, the cash flow went down a little bit. So that's the first statement. The statement of cash flows tells you a lot. The second technique is ratio analysis. And what ratio analysis does is it takes different pieces of information from the financial statements and puts one number over another number, and it creates a new number that has economic significance. It means something. And it also allows comparisons. We'll talk more about that in a second. So if you look at any finance textbook, you'll see financial ratios classified in many different ways. Almost all of them will have profitability and liquidity. Debt management can be called capital structure ratios, debt management ratios. Asset management ratios can be called activity ratios. There are different categories. It doesn't really matter. But basically, profitability, we're asking, is the organization have revenues greater than expenses? So even for a not-for-profit, we need profits because we need income to replace equipment and to upgrade services, expand services, and so on. Liquidity, the basic question we're asking there is, can they meet their cash obligations as they become due? And when we talk about liquidity, we're really talking about the next 365 days. That's what differentiates accountants' view of the world. Accountants' short-term view of the world is less than 1 year, and long-term is greater than 1 year. So when we're talking about liquidity, we're really asking the question, can an organization meet its liabilities over the next 12 months? And then next is debt management. Does the business have the right mix of debt and equity? And this is sort of the capital structure decision that we talked about last term. There are ratios to measure the mix of debt and equity. And finally, asset management. Does the business have the right amount of assets for the volume of business that it has? Interpreting them is sometimes easy and sometimes difficult. A single ratio, if I tell you a total margin of 7%, that may not mean that much. But if you compare 7% this year to 4% last year, that tells you something. It tells you that profitability improved. If I tell you that the total margin is 7% for this organization, but the industry average as a whole is 10%, then that tells you that, yes, it's positive, but it's not doing as well as other organizations in the industry. This is called trend analysis and comparative analysis, or time series and cross-sectional. And both these techniques are typically used in any sort of financial statement analysis. So let's go through some typical financial ratios and see what we come up with. So from the statements, the financial statements for Riverside, the total margin can be calculated as the net income divided by total revenue gives you 7.3%. So what does that 7.3% mean? Interpret that number in words. Vic.
So for every dollar in total revenue you're getting 7.3 cents of net income?
Exactly. And while you're on a roll, do the one at the bottom as well.
So for
return
every
on
dollar
assets.
in total assets you have, you're turning that into 5.7 cents of net income, or 5.7% return?
That's right. So every dollar of total assets that you've got in the organization, you're generating 5.7 cents of net income. So we then have the last one, which is return on equity. And total equity in the for-profit sector will be the value of all the shares. And in the not-for-profit sector, it's called net assets, or it's the sum of all the contribution capital, the philanthropy, government grants, and retained earnings that the organization has accumulated over time. And this is, in this organization, is $8, 8%. So again, it's exactly the same interpretation. For every dollar of equity, this organization is generating 8 cents in profit. So look at those. Look at the table. We've got 2 years of data and the industry average. What do you notice? What do you conclude looking at that table?
Since 09.
Okay, that's the
above industry average on 2 of the 3 segments.
Okay, so that's the conclusion I would draw, that they are getting, their profitability has improved between 2009 and 2010 on all of the ratios. They're better than the industry average on 2 of them, not so on the return on equity. And there may be reasons for that. We cannot tell what the reasons are. Financial ratio analysis gives you lots of questions to ask and few answers. So let's look at some common liquidity ratios. The current ratio is defined as current assets divided by current liabilities. So what does that 2.3 times mean? Interpret it in words. Exactly. So for every dollar of liabilities, every bill that you have over the next 1 year, you've got $2.3 in assets, short-term assets, to meet those liabilities. So if that ratio was 0.5, what would that tell you? That's not a good thing. You've got more current liabilities than you do current assets. Suppose the current ratio is 100. Do we celebrate and go have a party? Robbie.
You're probably not investing, you probably got too much cash on hand or something like that. You should be investing that in long-term securities and whatnot.
Exactly. If you've got a current ratio of 100, and believe me, there are organizations around that do, then instead of these, remember these are current assets and current liabilities. That's everything that comes due in 12 months over all your assets that can be liquidated with 12 months. If you've got a current ratio of 100, It's exactly as Robbie says. You've got a lot of money probably parked in cash, or you've got some, what's another reason?
You're about to buy something.
Sorry?
You're about to buy something.
Yeah, you could be park it in cash because you're about to buy something. That's a good reason. But what's in the numerator of current assets? That could also be an issue. So if it's accounts receivable, is that good news if you got 100? You got your massive accounts receivable, which sounds good, but unless you think that those, unless you're assured that you're going to collect all those accounts receivable, that could be a problem as well. So you have to look at what's in the numerator and the denominator to interpret a lot of these ratios. Days cash on hand, cash and marketable securities divided by cash expenses over 365, and that's 22.5 days. Interpret that in words. Rochelle.
With no new money coming in, you currently have enough cash on hand to keep your organization's doors open for 22.5 days.
Exactly, that's the precise answer. So if you assume that you have no more money coming in, this organization has enough cash and marketable securities to keep the organization running for 22.5 days. So here would be the answer that Robbie gave a few minutes ago would be the exact answer. If this was 500 days, you got 500 days to cash on hand, then that is precisely the problem. You've got way too much money parked in cash. There are many hospitals in the United States that have got days cash on hand of 1. So what would you make of that?
You're toeing the line pretty closely.
They have North Carolina since he tracks system.
That could sad but true. The reality is there's two possible explanations actually. One is that the hospital or the organization is close to bankruptcy, has very little cash in its bank account. The second possibility is that if you, let me ask you then, suppose, let's look at Chatham, which is owned by UNC. What might UNC do to Chatham's cash?
Use it for other,
Sorry?
use it for other things, like,
Yeah, I mean, there's a financial process called sweeping, where at 11:59 at every night, I'm not saying this happens at Chatham, I don't know what happens at Chatham, but I know at a lot of system-owned organizations, the mothership sweeps the cash of all the children at 11:59 p.m. so that they wake up the next morning and all their cash is gone. And that they do it for various reasons that we'll talk about when we talk about working capital management. So what you'll find is you may find organizations that have got 0 days cash on hand, which sounds awful, but you have to dig deeper and find out why. And it may be the fact that it's owned by a system that may be part of a larger system. So look at this table and tell me what you see, tell me what you think.
The current ratio is above industry average, police, and the days cash on hand is below industry average, but
Right.
improving.
All right, so that's what I would conclude as well. So this is conflicting. They're doing better than the industry on the current ratio, but they're doing worse than the industry on days cash on hand. So what might be the reason for that? We've already talked about it in the last few minutes. Accounts receivable. They could have a higher than average level of accounts receivable, which jacks up their current ratio, but they could have lower than average days cash on hand.